So you've got Logic Pro X and you want to write some microtonal music. Or maybe you don't have Logic Pro X, but you still want to follow along and learn some ideas for making microtonal music. Maybe you've heard about a tuning system called 31 equal divisions of the octave. Or maybe you haven't. Either way, stick around and kill like 20 minutes or something. As you might have guessed, this tuning system divides the octave into 31 equal parts, as opposed to the system you're probably used to, 12 EDO, which divides the octave into 12 equal parts. 31 sounds like an overwhelming amount of notes, and it may seem like it's just a random number that someone picked out of a hat, even though you know that that's definitely not the case. But you don't have to use all 31 notes, and the way that the numbers line up, 31 can be used to make very microtonal sounding music, not so microtonal sounding music, and lots of stuff in between. It can open up a lot of cool possibilities to be able to use all 31 notes, but you can also make plenty of great microtonal music without using anywhere near all of them. In fact, Logic's microtonal tuning settings only let you use up to 12 notes, with a few other limitations as well.
Get on it, Logic.
There's lots of ways to use 31 EDO that sound further off from 12, but the way that we're going to use 31 right now will give you some very familiar sounding scales with a few subtle differences that might make them more appealing. And it will also give you some scales with familiar shapes but a notably different vibe. When I started working on this video, I was going to do a 31 EDO version of a 12-note just intonation tuning called Centaur, discovered by the excellent microtonalist Kraig Grady. But when you approximate a just intonation scale in 31 EDO, things can change a lot. And one of the big reasons is that certain commas get tempered out. Tempering out commas basically means that two JI ratios that are different intervals are approximated as the same note. This makes there more
relatively consonant intervals within a relatively small span of notes.
What happens when I approximate Centaur tuning in 31 EDO is it becomes the same notes as another tuning in 31 EDO, which is extremely close to a historical tuning used in Western classical music, called chord or meantone. I found this really interesting because I think of Centaur as a way to mix microtonal sounding intervals and not very microtonal sounding intervals. But chord or meantone was made for Western classical music, which doesn't usually make me think of intentionally microtonal sounding music. I should note that some composers used a 12-tone version of chord or meantone to get some new flavors though. A YouTuber named moraitis discusses this in a few videos which I'll link to in the description. There's also an idea called septimal meantone where people use notes far apart in a meantone circle of fifths to get what are called septimal intervals. Septimal intervals are a certain type of more microtonal sounding intervals that are also the new type of intervals that you can access in Centaur. I didn't know about the overlap between the 12-note version of 31 EDO meantone and the 31 EDO approximation of Centaur until making this video. But it makes it all the better for teaching some microtonal ideas because you can figure out where the new diatonic scales are just by paying attention to the interval between F and B flat, the wolf fifth. So with all of that in mind, let's go to Logic. Go to File, Project Settings, Tuning, click on the circle that says User, and then copy the numbers that I have on the keyboard here. Usually when you hear someone say cents, they mean 1/100th of a dollar, but in music it means 1/100th of a semitone. You can add or subtract up to 100 cents from each note in the chromatic scale, and you can get the number as specific as 3 decimal places. I don't think the tuning on Logic is actually accurate down to the 1,000th of a cent, and I don't know if that would be meaningful since the pitch of most instruments wavers at least a little, but it's probably better to be as accurate as possible, so the more decimals the merrier. Now that we've got the notes adjusted, I closed the tuning settings and put up a keyboard just so you have a better visual. And you can look at the piano roll as well if that helps. Anywhere you play a diatonic scale, if it doesn't have both F and B flat in it, you can use it basically the same as you would in standard tuning, and it won't sound particularly microtonal. You'll mostly just have very pure sounding thirds and slightly less pure sounding fifths. You'll probably notice the nicer thirds a lot more than the less pure fifths though, unless you're making chords with chordal and quintal harmony, which still doesn't really sound much harsher, and honestly it sounds more interesting in my opinion, so yeah. It's a bit different with other types of scales, but when you start building diatonic scales with the F and B flat in them, you get scales that sound like the ones you're used to, but with kind of a different vibe to them. So for example, if you want the normal sounding minor scale, you can play in A minor. But if you want a new type of minor, which is called subminor, you can play in C minor, which has the F and B flat. For a bit of an idea of how the notes in this tuning relate to each other, the fourth between F and B flat is somewhat flat. This means that the minor seventh of C will be somewhat flat as well. The relationship between B flat and E flat is still a normal perfect fifth, so in relationship to the C, the E flat will be a bit flatter as well. Since C and G are a normal perfect fifth apart, and the E flat and B flat have a certain amount of extra flatness, you'll end up with what's called a subminor seventh chord, which is basically a minor seventh chord where the minor intervals are within a kind of loose range of extra flatness. People also often use these terms to refer to specific JI ratios and their approximations. But microtonal musicians often use different words to refer to the same intervals and ideas, depending on who it is and the specific context, and I find it's usually better not to get too caught up in the names, at least if you're just making music, because whatever you call it, it still sounds the same. If you play in C major, it's just regular major. But if you play in C sharp, for example, it becomes
super major.
Basically, super major is to subminor what major is to minor. If you have a super major seventh chord, it's a major seventh chord where the major intervals are within kind of a loose range of extra sharpness. Just like with the subminor third and seventh, people also often use these terms to mean specific JI ratios and their approximations. Once you start using scales with the B flat and F though, everything changes, because this interval is just wide enough that the Fire Nation can sneak in and attack. Well, not really, but something does pop up. If you play a chord with the B flat as the root, the perfect fifth is the wolf fifth. Chords with the wolf fifth between the root and the fifth have kind of a unique sound and you might like it, but it can also be kind of jarring and you might want to avoid it at least a lot of the time, or use it carefully as I'm going to discuss shortly. In this 12-note tuning, there's also two 7th chords that have this wolf fifth between the 3rd and the 7th. These two chords are the minor 7th chord on G, which has a subminor 3rd and a regular minor 7th, and the major 7th chord built on F sharp, which has a major 3rd and a super major 7th. Also, the C sharp major 6th chord, which has a super major 3rd and a major 6th, has that wolf fifth in there as well, between the 3rd and the 6th. To make this tutorial, I've been listening to all these chords with wolf intervals a lot, so to some extent I may just be getting more used to these sounds, and everyone's ears are different anyway, so use your own judgment, but I really don't find these three chords to be that dissonant. If you do want to avoid the wolf fifth in these chords, though, you can just play the triads and the wolf fifth won't come up, since you don't have the 6th or the 7th. I don't really use sus chords a lot, because they're pretty sus, but two other chords with the wolf fifth are the E flat sus 2 and F sus 4. These two chords are a little dissonant still, but they're also not too dissonant, and the dissonance is pretty easy to resolve. I find the sus 4 chord resolves strongly to a major chord, and the sus 2 resolves strongly to a minor chord, because there's that motion by a very narrow semitone. But you can also try it the other way around, with the sus 2 chord resolving to super major, and the sus 4 resolving to subminor. I should say if you invert the wolf fifth into a fourth, it also approximates the 21st note in the harmonic series. It's still kind of dissonant to varying degrees depending on the context, but there's two other chords I want to mention with this interval that sound really cool. Both of them with the F as the root. The first one has the narrow fourth, a perfect fifth, and a subminor 7th. The subminor 7th is the 7th note in the harmonic series, and it might sound unfamiliar, but it is generally considered consonant. This chord I just played sounds pretty stable to me. One thing that makes it sound stable is that the narrow fourth is connected to that subminor 7th by a perfect fourth. And that perfect fourth is an inversion of the perfect fifth, which, at least in Western harmony, is generally thought of as the most consonant interval that isn't thought of as just being the same note, like say an octave or a unison. To put it much more simply, even though the narrow fourth isn't very stable with the root, the subminor 7th and the perfect fourth kind of make a chain connecting it to the root, making it sound more stable. By the way, you can make it sound even less dissonant by moving the narrow fourth up an octave. The second chord is the same except that it has a major 7th instead of a harmonic 7th. The major 7th is the 15th note of the harmonic series, but it's somewhat dissonant, and more importantly, it makes a tritone with a narrow fourth. This chord sounds pretty cool though, and it resolves nicely to a major chord. Just like the last chord, you can make this chord less dissonant by moving the narrow fourth up an octave. I'll go into more detail about how to write chord progressions in subminor and super major keys with the basic triads while avoiding the wolf fifth, but I don't want this video to be super long and repetitive, so just remember the root notes and the other stuff I mentioned if you want to use the other chord types, or the other diatonic scales with B flat and F. There are three subminor keys in this tuning: C, F, and G. In the key of C, the B flat is the 7th, so the chord on the 7 will have a wolf fifth between the root and the 5th. It's pretty easy to build a chord progression in a minor key that doesn't have a chord built on the 7, but you can also play an F if you want the chord built on the 7 and you don't need a chord built on the 4. Or you can play in G if you need the chord built on the 5 or on the 7, but you don't need the chord built on the 3. One of the most popular minor chord progressions in pop music is 1, 6, 3, 7. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out which key you would use if you wanted to make sure none of the chords have a wolf fifth. This chord progression has a chord built on the 3 and a chord built on the 7, so the answer is F. When you're on the 5 chord in any minor key, a lot of the time you're going to make it a major chord or a dominant 7 chord, so harmonic minor. I don't want this video to be too long and dense, so we're not going to explore all of the different chords built from each scale degree of harmonic minor in each of the 12 keys in this video. But if you want a major, super major, or dominant 7 chord on the 5 in any minor key, it won't have a wolf fifth unless you're in the key of E flat harmonic minor, because the 5 of E flat is B flat. Here's a chord progression in C sub minor. The chords are C sub minor, F sub minor, and G7. This tuning has several types of dominant 7 chords with different qualities, and you might like some of them more than others, but one really important one is called the harmonic 7th chord, which has a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a subminor 7th. The only harmonic 7th chords in this tuning are F7 and C7. This chord sounds more restful than the Dom7 chord you usually hear, and it works great as a tonic chord. You might not want to have this as your 5 chord if you want a strong dominant to tonic sound, but you might want to have it as the 5 chord anyway because it sounds really nice and kind of unique. And because it's built on the 5, there's still the expectation for it to go to 1 depending on your ears. This little thing is in F sub minor, so the 5 chord is that special C7. One place these chords work really well is in a 12-bar blues on C, the one with just Dom7 chords built on the C, F, and G. The C7 is a harmonic 7th chord, so is the F7, and the G7 is a normal Dom7 chord, so it leads strongly back to the C. There are 4 slightly different super major keys in this tuning: E flat, A flat, B flat, and D flat. The B flat super major scale has the wolf fifth chord on the 1, so you might not consider it usable. The E flat scale has this chord on the 5, the A flat scale has this chord on the 2, and the D flat scale has this chord on the 6. I'm listing off a bunch of stuff, but again you can just remember that if you're using basic triads, it's always the chord on the B flat. To avoid the wolf fifth in the triads, it's basically the same idea as subminor. One of the most popular major chord progressions in pop music is 1, 5, 6, 4. You can pause the video and try to figure out which key wouldn't have the wolf fifth in this chord progression. This chord progression has the 5 chord and the 6 chord, so the answer is A flat. If you're on a chord with the B flat as the root and the F is the 5th, you can also just omit the F from the chord. But if you're doing that, you might want to be careful about not putting too much emphasis on the F during that chord in the rest of the arrangement, or you might want to just completely avoid it. In this chord progression, the third chord is on the B flat, but the F only appears on weak beats like the 4 in the bass line and the N of 2 in the melody. If you want to completely avoid the chords with the wolf fifth, you can write so many chord progressions with the ideas I just mentioned. But if you do want to use the wolf fifths, but you want to make the harshness more subtle, here's some tips. If you watched my video on 9 EDO, you know that if you use mallet and flute sounds, they can make intervals that would sound harsh on a lot of other instruments not sound harsh anymore. So I tried these sounds out with that B flat super major chord, and lo and behold. But for some reason, maybe to some degree, it's just something to do with the piano sounds on Logic. But from my observations, the piano sounds seem to emphasize the harshness of certain intervals more than most of the other sounds do, including a lot of the super major and subminor intervals. The Afro-Cuban piano sound seems to emphasize this harshness even more than the other piano sounds I've looked at, but it might be partially related to the fact that it sounds a lot more clear and less muddy than the other piano sounds. So if I want a piano sound, I'm probably still going to want to use this one. On the other hand, the cello sound seems to be pretty good with these intervals. I only have a general grasp of how timbre relates to harmony, and I don't have a graph or anything of the acoustic makeup of all the instruments on Logic anyway. So other than the mallet and flute sounds, I'm just making observations based on what I hear. It's always better to learn more about this stuff, but relying heavily on my ears seems to have served me well enough, at least for now. So if you're trying to figure out which timbres work better with the chords you're using, I would say your ears are really useful for this. So I've got this chord progression which I'm playing with the Afro-Cuban piano sound. Right now I'm also not using any of the ideas I'm going to talk about for controlling the harshness. You might notice that the first chord has this somewhat harsh sound, and that's because of the wolf fifth between the root and the fifth. The first thing I can do is move it to a part of the bar that has less weight than directly on the first beat. If I start the progression with another chord and then play that dissonant chord on the third beat, it's less noticeable. Then to make it even less noticeable than that, I can play it on an offbeat like the end of 3. One thing that's extremely effective is to just arpeggiate the chords, and then you can still hear a subtle difference in the tuning, but it's not something you would ever find off-putting. Well, maybe it would. Everyone's ears are different, but I think it gives a pretty good result. This chord progression is in a super major key, and you might find super major chords can also sound a bit harsh, so I think arpeggiating the chords is a really good option in this situation. Adding some extra reverb can help as well. It also kind of hides the dissonance when you have a melody over top. Just to be clear, you don't have to do all these things at once. If I just do, say, the reverb and the melody, it doesn't really sound jarring. And if I just put the chord on a weak beat and add extra reverb, the dissonance becomes pretty subtle. Just use your ears, maybe ask someone for a second opinion if you like, and yeah, stuff. Just so you can hear the difference, this is how it would sound in 12 EDO. And this is how it sounds with what we're doing. I find the 31 EDO one sounds a lot less stiff and more colorful. But maybe you have a different take and that's completely fine. It's alright to be wrong. So there's also many other chords and scales in this tuning, but now you've got a lot of new possibilities to work with. Don't be afraid to try out different ideas. Maybe look at the notes in the tuning settings and compare the sizes of intervals in different keys. Use your ears and see what you like the sound of, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. If you haven't already, I would really appreciate if you like this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a merry microtonal day and see you next time.